Palestinians in the Gaza Strip can expect humanitarian aid in the coming days after Egypt agreed to reopen the Rafah crossing, the only route in and out of the silt-in enclave. But it is being limited to 20 trucks, much fewer than the 100 a day before the violence of the past few weeks. US President Joe Biden, however, says that represents a first tranche of aid. This comes in a breakthrough agreement to reopen the crossing following discussions between Mr. Biden and his Egyptian counterpart, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. It was negotiated as the US president flew home after a short visit to Israel where he met Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Mr. Biden's mission there? Well, show support for Israel while recognizing that most Palestinians aren't affiliated with militant group Hamas. Also reduce the likelihood of a wider war and provide assurances to the world that the US isn't overlooking the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. So, did Mr. Biden achieve what he set out to do? Global Affairs correspondent Jonathan Eyal gets to the point. John, what does President Biden's visit to Tel Aviv and his remarks of support for Israel against Hamas mean for the conflict? How much would that escalate the already polarizing situation?
Well, the US president had two objectives. The first one was to actually show support for Israel. But what we need to remember is that this show of support was accompanied by quite a few warnings to the Israeli leadership about what they proposed to do in Gaza. So there were some very pointed remarks by the US president about the need for humanitarian help for the civilian population, and most importantly, about the need for Israel to have an exit strategy. It's easy to get into a conflict, it's much more difficult to get out, as the Americans themselves know only too well. The second point was to try to warn countries like Iran, which has a lot of proxies in the region, not to join the fray, not to get involved in the fighting. Has the American president succeeded? Up to a point, yes. As you said yourself, the humanitarian convoys are coming in. They're coming in very slowly and in lower quantities, but they are coming in, something that Israel did not intend to do before. The same applies to the supplies of water in short quantities, but still better than before.
Jordan cancelled a planned four-way summit with Mr. Biden and leaders of Egypt and the Palestinian Authority, who are key players in this conflict. But he is hoping to continue these talks once he's back in Washington, and we know he is back. He's treading a thin line as he manages both sides of the conflict. How do you think this will play out?
Well, the reality is that most Arab leaders don't want Hamas to win. Hamas is considered an extremist organization by most of the, at least pro-Western Arab leaders. The reason that they had to tell Mr. Biden that he couldn't come to Jordan for a meeting with Arab leaders was because the visit coincided with the bombing of the hospital, which at the time looked like an Israeli operation. The question is much more controversial at the moment, but at the time it looked like that. So what it shows is that the Arab leaders continue to talk to the United States behind the scenes. The discussions about the humanitarian convoys continues. But it also shows how much the Arab leaders are under the pressure of their own streets. They had to cancel the meeting with the US president because they simply couldn't be seen to be meeting with him while the streets were teeming with people demonstrating against Israel. So it is, yes, a very fine line that the US president has to tread there between supporting Israel but at the same time not appearing to be throwing in America's lot entirely with Israel in this conflict.
So on that note, Jonathan, can the US even play the role of mediator in this conflict? Or are there any other possible mediators beside the US?
It's very easy to knock the US out, to say that they are not impartials and therefore they can't play a role. But the reality remains that in this week, we had Beijing sending a so-called mediator in the region, and nobody pays him any attention at all. the Russians are seen very much as an actor, but as a spoiler rather than someone who could kind of broker any kind of a deal. So at the end of the day, the United States remains the only power that could bring the sides together, the only power that could force Israel to start talking seriously to the Palestinians about a potential settlement after this awful war stops.